So again, we are continuing our program of this emergency convening Beyond the Pale, the systemic vilification of black men and boys. We just heard from Dr. Tommy J. Curry, a powerful presentation on the dehumanization of black youth. Are you ready for our next speaker? Are you ready for our next speaker? All right, we got coming to the microphone, our brother, all the way from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, who is a licensed psychologist and assistant professor of psychology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Our brother and your brother, coming to the microphone, Dr. Evan Auguste. Put your hands together for our brother.
Thank you. I'm honored by this invitation. I didn't know I was going to be following a black psychologist, as a matter of fact, so I feel very seen in this space, and I'm very excited to share some of the work that we have going on, I think, to deepen some of the conversation we've already had around psychology, mental health, and how that's been used to weaponize. One thing I didn't expect, and I wanted to anchor us in, with that last question, what I think was a brilliant question, a brilliant exchange, it reminded me of a quote from Amos Wilson. He says, the true nationalist is also not afraid to overthrow tradition when tradition is unproductive. He's not one who just gives obeisance to African tradition out of some blind ignorance. He's one who says, even though I revere the African past, I revere the African tradition, that tradition can be built upon. I and my generation have something to add to that tradition. I have a right then to use the legacy of that tradition to confront the realities of my current times and thus modify that tradition and see to the current times and thus modify. So I just wanted to anchor in that, right? That's what we're doing when we're talking about black and African-centered psychology. We're talking about a tradition that's rooted in that radical reclamation, right, of our ceremonies, of our ways of being, in ways that help us materially shift our current conditions. And so one of the things I want to do first, next slide, please, is anchor us in the urgency of what we're talking about. Right, a lot was discussed when it came to police killings. What I want to note, though, is the intersection, right, of how mental illness is constructed and conceived and the very dire consequences for black men. I'm going to anchor us in two stories specifically. Up to the right is Najee Seabrooks. Najee Seabrooks was from Paterson, New Jersey. He played a central role in the Paterson Healing Collective. He was extremely active in violence interruption programs, healing his community. And when he experienced his own distress and tried to reach out to his community, the police actually intercepted that call and went on to kill Najee Seabrooks. This happened last year. Everybody here was killed just in the last year. This is Ervo Otieno, somebody who was incarcerated, institutionalized in Virginia, actually. And when he was experiencing crisis within the confines of the state hospital, again, the psychiatric security wrestled him to the ground, suffocated, and killed him. Right. So we're talking about people who, black men who in their generation and in their distress are consistently made to be threat, consistently made to be criminal, and this is what has dire consequences, right? Not just for the individuals, it has consequences for the individuals, but it also reduces the creativity that we're allowed to advocate for in the service of our own lives. So next slide, please. I love beginning with this conception specifically. There's a lot of people who've made this point. I was talking with Baba Naeem Akbar last year, and he did some really fantastic work in identifying the different ways, the alien self-disorders. But amidst that conceptualization, he also had these ideas of, those biological disorders, right? Those ideas that there are still these mental health and psychiatric disorders that exist in some ways outside the bounds of culture. What I like about this quote, and it says, within the United States cultural zeitgeist, there is no blackness without madness, nor madness without blackness, is it anchors us in the fact that the very conception, these ideas, these tools of psychology were rooted in anti-blackness. We don't understand the practice of psychology. We don't understand the practice of mental health. We don't understand the practice of care within the confines of the United States without anti-blackness, right? Without anchoring how we understand disease and disorder with how the African person conceives of freedom. Next slide, please. And so I don't think it needs to be said, right? We know that mental illness historically has been used as a tool for social control. Right? We know that when we're looking at a specific U.S. American context, we're talking about advancing specifically white, capitalist, white supremacist understandings of community. That's how we conceive of mental health. What a lot of people don't know, because when you talk about, I teach some intro, I teach some black psychology, and people, when they think about these historical psychologists, they'll say, well, of course they're racist. Right? Everybody back then was racist. Right? They had some good ideas, but you know, the racism, that's just what was going on. We could take we could salvage these ideas. What a lot of people don't understand is the racism is what shapes the practice and understanding of these ideas. So we have some people who've taken psychology. I'm gonna go in professor mode real quick. People taking intro before? A few hands. Okay, y'all know who G. Stanley Hall is? Who's G. Stanley Hall? See, that's, oh man, golly. Who's the intro? I gotta talk to them, right? Okay. So G. Stanley Hall, right, he's credited with being America's first, right, psychologist, one of the first presidents of the American Psychological Association. And you look at his intervention on American society, his idea is that African people possess an innate, right, criminality, an innate savagery. And so for the mental health of the nation, it's a requirement then that African peoples need to exist in enslavement. The idea there is that the experiences of civilization, the experiences of freedom are far too complex for the African person to handle. And it's the best thing for us to construct our society, right, in this fashion. Those are some of his, not just side notes that he has, those are some of his primary interventions that he's making. We have Carl Jung. Carl Jung tends to be a little bit more popular. People have heard of Carl Jung. I'm seeing some head nods. Carl Jung, one of his pioneering ideas is seen as the ideas of the collective unconscious, right? The idea that there's these kind of core ideas that organize how we understand being. What a lot of people don't know is that Carl Jung developed those ideas from his interactions with the Uganda people, right? So we're talking about before the African traditions, the African ways of being that we can lean into as ways of curing and saving ourselves. For Carl Jung, he saw that as, in fact, the absence of consciousness, right? He sees that as the most base form of understanding, and thus roots his idea of the collective unconscious in that. What does that do? That erases a lot of the particular, specific ways of being that came from, right, a Bantu thought that he was in contact with. Right, and so the very core ideas of a collective unconscious, which is foundational for a lot of psychodynamic thinking, is already originated in an inability to conceptualize and understand African thought. We move to Robert Yerkes, right? Robert Yerkes, another one of the American Psychological Association's presidents, who, as they're wrestling with the ideas of integration, makes the argument that based on the intelligence quotient, that gorillas are better served for American society than African peoples, right? He, along with a number of former presidents, would go on to lead various eugenics organizations based on this very fact, that we're dealing with the problem of these African and black peoples who have no service if not in captivity. Can I get the next slide, please? And so this is one of the things that happens, I'm gonna move over here, is you have these ideas, these theories. What these theories do get concretized in diagnoses, right? This is how we begin shaping a discipline. So people have heard, if you're here, I'm assuming you've heard of drapetomania before, right? Drapetomania is the idea that for the enslaved person to desire and yearn for freedom, to pursue that freedom, represents mental illness, mental disease. This comes from Samuel Cartwright, right? The uncontrollable urge of enslaved Africans to escape enslavement. When Samuel Cartwright conceptualized this idea, he in fact formulated the entirety of the Haitian Revolution as an epidemic of drapetomania, right? This is how disorder gets weaponized. And once you get your disorder, you need treatment. And so this is how we're seeing the building blocks of a profession. The treatment, forced enslavement, right? The natural condition of the enslaved African for Cartwright is enslavement. This is what produces treatment. You get these ideas of general intellectual inferiority, right? The comprehensive idea that biologically black people are inferior. And so you get, series of eugenics campaigns. Some of the first, I believe, 30 to 40 American Psychological Association presidents were also the leaders and presidents of various eugenics campaigns. So the idea of controlling the African and black population is interwoven with the roots of psychology and psychiatry in the US. We move to protest psychosis, right? As we're going through this is also sequential, right? So we're coming already to around the 1960s, 1970s. The protest psychosis is the idea that the disproportionately black men that people in the hospital were coming into contact with were in fact experiencing, right, delusions shaped by, right, black power activists. Right, people who were holding up their fists as they were confined to the hospital were in fact experiencing a particular type, right, of schizophrenia that warranted its own diagnosis. The treatment being, right, continued, often indefinite institutionalization. Next slide, please. And so, again, with the building blocks, right? Now that you have your theory, you have your disorder, from those arise the institutions, right? The solid building blocks to capture black and African peoples. You get out in Virginia, the Central Lunatic Asylum for the Colored Insane, where you had predominantly black and African peoples, right, captured, right, for experiences, for the disorders of drapetomania. In fact, you get a number of people, in fact, forced to do labor for various surrounding villages, surrounding towns, surrounding hospitals, right, in service of their economic benefit. One of the ways we see, right, psychiatry and the psychiatric hospital specifically interwoven with a capitalist product. You get the Ionia State Hospital for the criminally insane. Again, the forced institutionalization of disproportionately black men for engaging, right, in protest, engaging in activism, engaging in a fight for their lives. Does anybody happen to know, when I talk about schizophrenia, who schizophrenia used to be a disorder for, disproportionately? Does anybody know the answer? Boom. I love this crowd. Y'all already know all the things, right? And after this point, right, it becomes a diagnosis and disorder specifically used for black men. Can I get the next slide, please? And so around 2020, 2021, you got the American Psychological Association trying to apologize, as did a number of organizations, for their history and their participation in the forced institutionalization and enslavement of black peoples. I'm tying this specifically to what Dr. Curry had said in his presentation, right? You get this narrative of progress as you get more and more black elites introduced to the halls of the American Psychological Association. Right? One of the periods on that timeline is the election of a Kenneth Clark, for instance, the first black president of the American Psychological Association. And as you go through it, you also see the removal of the mentioning of the continued violence that goes on specifically against predominantly black men who end up being institutionalized. And so I was one of the co-chairs for the American the Association of Black Psychologists Task Force in responding to the apology. Right? We leveraged the work of Bobby Wright to name that in this apology, you're leaving out the continued assault on black psychic life, right, when you do this. The torture campaigns that the association oversaw were completely left out of this. The political assaults were completely left out in the ways that the APA continues to accredit and train people at sites of torture, incarceration, institutionalization was completely left out of this. Right, can we get the next slide, please? And so Amos Wilson makes the point that if people can integrate into history, they can also disintegrate into history as a warning for framing narratives around progress. Frantz Fanon says it's important that we understand that psychiatry is an auxiliary of the police. Right? So as we condemn, as we are concerned over policing as a weapon and a form of death in our communities, it's important to understand that psychiatry often is used as another tool of capture. Often when we have conversations around reform, of bettering the conditions of community, you get people introducing, what if we just introduce a little bit more mental health? What if we get more psychologists on board? But what that does is erase the ways that carcerality have framed and shaped this profession. Can I get the next slide? So my colleagues and I at the Scholars for Elevating Equity created this framework to understand, right, how this operates. Because again, you have your core theories of how we understand white supremacy, your core theories of how you understand blackness. And from that, that's where your ideas of mental illness, your ideas of criminalization come from. A lot of people don't know when you're thinking about criminology, you're talking about conceptualization from a white Italian psychiatrist, in fact. And so you're using and you're weaponizing these ideas of mental illness to outlaw, to ban certain modes of thinking, certain ways of being, and rendering onto these people's distinct social consequences that only go around to reproduce, right, and reify those ideas of mental illness. Get the next slide, please. And so to anchor this, right, we're talking about a history. What a lot of people don't fully sit with is that we get the continued application of these diagnoses rooted in racism that continue to disproportionately affect, right, black men. When black and white people present with similar symptoms, black people are more likely to be diagnosed with psychotic disorders. White people are more likely to be diagnosed with mood disorders. When black and white people present with psychotic symptoms, people are more likely to support the police use of force against black people. People are less likely to support the police use of force against white people. Right? And I was doing some reading in the literature, and people tried to explain that, oh no, it's just that black people present with more psychosis, right? It's not race in and of itself, it's the perception and the reception of diagnoses of schizophrenia that causes this. But what people miss in that conceptualization is that schizophrenia in and of itself has become a racialized disorder that is equipped and used to erase disproportionately black men. At the next slide, please. And so where do people go? Right? So we have a lot of criticism, right? The prison industrial complex tends to be center in our condemnation of anti-black violence. A lot of people don't understand the level of erasure, invisibilization, and violence that goes on inside our state hospitals as well. Right? According to the World Health Organization, there are routine human rights abuses. In 2020, I was a student finishing my PhD in clinical psychology. I'm also trained in forensic psychology, which we'll talk a bit about at the end. And we were introduced to the person who was over the legal protections of the hospital and said her phone was inundated. Right? She couldn't pick up the phone because of all the legal rights abuses that were coming along her line. Right? Within the confines of these types of hospitals, I've heard white psychiatrists say, listen, the best treatment, right, for this black patient would be if we could take him to the room over and kick the shit out of him. Right? That would be the best thing for this person. Right? You get people who are institutionalized and incarcerated indefinitely, very little oversight for wanting to exercise their political and legal rights. I've seen a black man who had been institutionalized at a hospital for some over 5 to 6 years. And when you talk to him, he was very clear on what happened with this case. I asked the psychologist, why is this man still here? Like, why isn't he allowed to pursue? He's like, he wants to take his case to trial. We think that's crazy, so he's going to continue to be here. Right? So you get the complete erasure of the political will of people once you enter into, right, these psychiatric institutions. And it's one of these pieces. When people talk about reform, when people talk about safety, you get people like Mayor Eric Adams, who just is going through his own indictment, right? Which, if you're in New York, you're celebrating that right now, right? Where you employ these ideas of forced institutionalization as ideas of care and community safety, when we know they're anything but. This is one of the ways that they continue to invisibilize the use of force, harm, and often death, right, that disproportionately unhoused black men and black boys have to experience. And the next slide, please. And so what I want to thread to, right, is we're talking specifically about ideas of mental illness, ideas of mental well-being, but the connecting thread is it's not purely these conceptions and ideas of mental illness outside of ourselves. What has been criminalized is the exact way that we think and produce ideas of freedom, safety, and community. So Cedric Robinson says, the first forms of struggle in the black radical tradition, however, were not structured by a critique of Western society, but from a rejection of European slavery and a revulsion of racism in its totality. Even then, the more fundamental impulse of black resistance was the preservation of a particular social and historical consciousness rather than a revolutionary transformation of feudal or merchant capitalist Europe. So with this, we're getting this idea that, right, Tommy Curry hinted towards, we're not talking about a reformation of an existing system. We're not talking about a specific type of, maybe you might want to call it like a multiculturalism that has become very popular within psychology. People were talking about specific ways of being rooted in how they knew to be in the world. This is what became criminalized. Can I get the next slide, please? And so one of the things that we have, right, from the literature of specifically black consciousness, which is important to note, right, the psychology in and of itself is already a sharp gateway. It is a very difficult pipeline for black people to get into. The training to become a specific black psychologist is even more rare, unfortunately. And so from those people, we get the ideas, the research on the health of black consciousness. So we might think about black consciousness through a Steve Biko, right, an attitude of the mind, a way of life for black people dedicated to collective liberation. And through this, we have, right, proxies. There's been research on black identity, critical consciousness, resistance. And in each of these studies that have come out, a lot of them in the last 3 to 4 years, we've seen it has these holistic psychological benefits. Right? It allows people to have more pro-social interactions. You're seeing aspects of community engagement. For black youth who are engaging in protest movement, they're feeling levels of hope amidst, right, a torrent of state-based violence. In addition to that, the connections with black history have been used, not just as treatment models, but studied and demonstrated to show it helps concretize people's identity and senses of self. And so we know that whether it be collective action, whether it be embodied resistance, each of these actions are things that are expressions, right, of a health of black consciousness. But we know they're framed as anything but. Can I get the next slide, please? You can keep hitting them. Oh, wait. Yeah, okay, we go right here. Right. And so this is, again, how these disorders and ideas arise. Those acts of embodied resistance, those acts that are symptomatic of a healthy black consciousness are what get disproportionately diagnosed. We know that ideas of what's often used as conduct disorder is disproportionately levied against black men and black boys specifically. We know that once, and we had a reference to the work of Philip Atiba Goff, we know that once you make interaction with the state itself, that's criminogenic in and of itself, right? You're socializing often black youth into environments that lead them to experience increased victimization, increased trauma, right? Often all based on, right, these ideas of how they express resistance, how they express health, how they express their desire for the future. I was talking to, when I was at the courts, I spent a year at the D.C. Superior Courts completing my training, and there was a black boy who had just lost his father. His father was the person he was most connected with. He was named for him, in fact. And since then, he'd been bouncing from house to house, kind of unable to find the type of family connection he needed to feel safe and whole. He was brought to me because when he was in the courtroom, he could not stop crying. He was inconsolable. For him, he saw what had happened with his father, who had also had interactions with the DC court system. He watched what was happening to him. He just saw the foreclosure of his future and ability to love. The judge sent him to me because they thought he was crazy, right? The judge sent him to me because his emotions were so high level, they thought this can only be psychosis. And you write on the letter that we could send him to the hospital, right, to forcibly institutionalize and treat him until he could sit on this courtroom and not cry. The ideas the desire to express love, the desires to express grief, right, the pain that black boys feel is seen as criminal and insane in and of itself. They sent it to me twice, in fact. But we didn't sign it the first time. They sent them back, I believe, a month later for the exact same thing. Because that's the only way they understand how to conceptualize, right, black pain, especially black boys' pain. A similar thing goes on when I would interact with a lot of the black boys who would come through the courtroom. I would ask them, like, if you could have 3 wishes, what's the first one that you wish for? What's the one thing that you want? And every single one of them, which I thought was fascinating, every single one of them said, I just want to get my family a house, a vehicle, so I can move away from all the violence that's going on around me. And for them, the way that they were understanding, engaging, whatever activity might have been in, was a way of advancing that, care and hope, right, for their family, but manifested in ways that the court can only see as violence. So these people is irredeemable. The number of black boys who came through there in chains is despicable. Right? And based on that, we get the historic denial of the category of adolescence itself. Right? So when we're talking about black boyhood, I think it's also important that we anchor within psychology, and thus within the law, black people were often not even afforded boyhood. They were conceptualized and understood only in relation to the perceived threat of their bodies themselves, which was explained beautifully by Professor Curry prior to this. So from the body to the mind to the spirit to hopes for the future, at every single level, we get the criminalization and the pathologization as it gets generated from black boys. Can I get the next slide, please? You can hit it twice, 'cause I think I put on little animation effects and whatnot. Yeah. And then as people develop, as boys develop, and they become actors, people who are intentional about saving and protecting their communities, generating the type of community groups that they've experienced at this point, right, that the state is not interested, right, in serving their communities. We talked about this, the need to be generative, right, for our own communities. We get the most severe state crackdown, right, of expressions of black male love. So you get Fred Hampton, you get Mumia, you get Sundiata, people who had dreams and hopes for ways that our community could create protections for themselves, could advocate and resist in ways that allowed people to thrive, meet some of the most harsh forms of state-based violence. And so it's important we thread this, right? It's not purely, right, the act in the bodies, it's the mind, the conception, the ways that we have to understand and think about healing and safety that become criminalized at every single level. Got the next slide, please. And so just recently, right, you get these policies, in fact, are reproducing. When you get black identity extremism becoming a priority for the FBI, we know that the FBI embedded informants in a series of racial justice movements targeting disproportionately black men and black boys. We know that protest-related charges were disproportionately and racially allocated and used against black men and black boys. And we know there's reported instances. I have a friend of mine who's a community organizer in Minneapolis who spoke about police paying off people in the community to disrupt racial justice movements as well, just so that they could crack down. One of the things I do want to add as well, just in terms of some of the research on menticide that can be understood within that framework, Marcus Board Jr., who's a colleague of mine over at Howard University, has a book called Invisible Weapons Theory that I would recommend for anybody who's interested in these theories. It's called Invisible Weapons Theory. And what he did was examine how the messaging of elected officials transform people's political efficacy. And so that messaging he saw for black people disproportionately shaped the way they could conceive a future. And so again, at every level, the ideas of thinking and producing action, producing thought in service for the community is demonized, is dissuaded, and it's destroyed. Can I get the next slide, please? I want to bring a really quick case example. So this is from the indictment of the Stop Cop City protesters in Atlanta, in Georgia. I want to name things really briefly. Right, we see that for the way that the state conceptualized it, right, we can see it's anchored in ideas of Black consciousness. We can see it's anchored in desires for justice within the confines of the United States, rooted in the disproportionate murder of Black men by police. And we can see the specific values, right? We can see that the ideas that anchor, those people, this is described by the state: collectivism, mutualism, mutual aid, social solidarity, right? Those sound great. Those sound beautiful. To me, to the state, this is what is anchoring a criminal organization. Because for the state, it doesn't matter how you articulate it, how you conceptualize it. The idea of Black thought in and of itself is what's criminal. Next slide, please. So this is Linda James Myers, right? So I'm gonna bring in a few African-centered psychologists, Black scholars. So again, I appreciate the alley-oop with that, right? Linda James Myers says, let me get on this side. The way the African-centered system is structured, we are one with the source of all things good. The extent to which we entertain the dominant Eurocentric conceptual system, at best, aspects of that truth will be fragmented in our experience. The choice of conceptual system is ours. Power is the ability to define reality. So I'm anchoring this because we've had a lot of appeals over the last few years for how can we introduce ideas of psychology, mental health into a criminal justice system to hopefully save Black men and Black boys. The piece I hope that's been made very clear is a lot of these tools in and of themselves were conceptualized at a foundational level only to advance that political project and only continue to do so. And so if we're to be serious about this political project, as I'm sure everybody is, it's about how can we adopt new, novel frameworks to meet the questions. Can I get the next slide, please? And so I'm gonna introduce this to everybody. We already have a Black psychologist right here, Professor Tommy Curry. I want everybody here to become a Black psychologist in your spare time as you can, right? And it's important because it's a distinct tradition, correct? In terms of applied psychology, Black psychology, as this conceptualized emerges in the 1970s during that specific era of Black political struggle. And inspired by the Black Panthers, they list a 10-point plan for how they want the field of mental health to engage with Black communities. It as a paradigm in and of itself, recognizes the political and structural location of Black peoples as ensnared colonial African peoples, and articulates theories and ideas of health that are rooted in that political analysis. Let me pop to the next one. And so one of the things I want to anchor in, so I was happy we had the friend over here who brought up Bobby Wright, because these are the concepts and ideas that are essential for us to better understand the conditions in which we are warring. So I want to go a little bit more in depth in these ideas of menticide for us to understand the structural and clinical understandings of how Black men and Black boys are experiencing criminalization. So Wright's menticide, again, despite a far too short life, we have a brilliant conception that exists at multiple levels. At the clinical level, Bobby Wright understood that Black suicide is a political dynamic, right, as opposed to individual. Right? So he outlined the growth of suicide as the result of a deliberate genocidal project. Right? And so when he looked at the mental health conditions, he could see that the way that society was structured, it was to reduce the types of thought, the type of thinking that was birthed from African ways of being, and to produce these conceptions of inferiority, right, that shaped and denigrated, Black humanity. What Bobby Wright was also clear about as well is that Black people had the right to be sick. He said that to say, as people who are ensnared and captured within this current colonial dynamic, we have to understand this is a fact of life for all of us. And it's our duty to one another, right, to rescue people as opposed to further condemn individuals. As a matter of structure, I'm gonna hop over here. He evidenced this theory through the pioneering, the popularity of behavioral theories within psychology. So he said, quoting Watson, who said, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-informed in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select: doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and the race of his ancestors." So for Bobby Wright, he's examining the psychological theories that are governing state policy and saying, if this is the theories that you're anchoring your decisions in, then we have nothing left to conclude but that this is willful and intentional production of Black death by the ways that, whether it be schooling, right, whether it be policing, whether it be the streets themselves, right, the ownership people have of their homes, these are concocted and constructed environments that must be held responsible for the consequences that they render onto Black peoples. A solution for menticide, and this would get carried on by one of his students, Kobe Cambone, was African worldview and consciousness. Can I get the next slide, please? And so what I want to anchor us in, because one thing that Professor Curry is correct about is within the world of psychology as it is, there are a lot of fantastic Black people doing psychology, which is important to note is distinct from Black psychologists. So when we look at the work that's being produced at the highest level, it tends to be anchored in how can we reduce the exposure to interpersonal racism, right? As explanatory for why we have disproportionate outcomes among Black people, among Black men, among Black boys. What my colleagues and I were interested in doing was how do we re-anchor our analysis of the Black psychological condition within conceptions of consciousness, right? Within conceptions of the way people understand love and community. And so what we did was we connected with How Our Lives Link All Together. They're a fantastic group. If you haven't connected with them, they could actually use some support right now. So if you all have any additional capacity, they do some fantastic African-centered work in New York. We collected with them and meditated on how do we understand the conception of Black consciousness as it is healing and healthy for Black people, with the goal of producing material tools that can then go on to be used in service of communities. Can I get the next slide, please? This is a bit on theory and method generation for anybody who's interested in doing similar work. We had a great point made by Professor Curry on the need for Black academics and Black scholars to be in community as they're generating their ideas to can have material benefit. And so what we did was anchoring in the experiences of people who had worked with radical movement. We created a collective, right, and moved through the different dimensions of Black consciousness as they were experienced, which gave birth to this method that we call remembrance, right? That ways that we leverage our traditions, we leverage our ceremonies to interact with our current political moment. Okay, next slide, please. And so this is what we're then grounding our responses and our strategies, right, for intervening on the continued pathologization of Black consciousness. So collective Black consciousness is a living synergy of ways of knowing and being that is oriented toward the collective actualization and liberation of Black communities. Collective Black consciousness is love in practice. It is shaped by a transcendence of physical space and time to access the deepest manifestations of Black cultural wisdoms. So through this generation, and once this product comes out, we'll be sure to share with anybody who's interested. Through this conception, we arrive with specific interventions and strategies for the various forms of structural and interpersonal harm that Black men and Black boys are experiencing. And the next slide, please. So we had a question, right? I love the question around how do we intervene on the constant assault of the psychological realities of Black men and Black boys. And one of the things the Association of Black Psychologists have pioneered, but a lot of groups have done them, I'm sure a lot of people have attended them, are the ideas of healing circles. One of the things we've done over the last few years is done more intentional research onto the experiences and benefits of healing circles for African consciousness. And so one of the essential pieces that we know, right, as opposed to a clinical intervention in which an expert goes in and delivers you a type of therapeutic service that is supposed to make you tolerate better your structural condition, it's essential that the healing circles are grassroots and community led and delivered, right? The aspects of tradition that are employed are based in the local conceptions, needs, and understandings of the community. So when we do them out in Boston, you have a lot of Haitian, Cape Verdean traditions that are incorporated to meet those political conditions. Right? When we do them in New York, we might have a lot of African-American, Dominican people who come in and shape those specific cultural practices. At this point, we've been holding them transnationally. We've held them in Haiti for people who are victims of kidnapping. We've held them for African refugees fleeing the Russo-Ukrainian war. And when we looked at the outcomes over 6 months, we saw more than purely the reduction in clinical symptoms, we saw transformations in consciousness. One of the things that most of our participants reported was a more firm understanding of Pan-African kinship. The idea is that they were connected with other African and Black peoples across political conditions and a deep need to be in service to them. So what we have here is a number of healing circle modalities. One of the things I would love to do, if anybody's interested, at the Association of Black Psychologists, we do a lot of trainings, we do a lot of consultations, right, for people to become leaders themselves, but also, again, to generate your own models that respond specifically to the needs. Because again, when we talk about the need for, and this is one of the things that frustrates me often with mental health influencers, Charlamagne will do a lot of conversations about this, but the need for more Black psychologists and Black psychiatrists. But again, we have an issue with the pipeline. We're only, I believe, it's 65% of Black psychologists report never receiving specific training for how to work with and diagnose Black peoples. Right? So telling people to go into service of people who are continuing to do work based in theories that we know are rooted in our pain and erasure does not produce the type of radical liberatory outcomes that we hope. Next slide, please. Another piece that we need to incorporate is culturally grounded crises response and training. So we know that as many as 52% of people killed by police are in some form of mental health crisis. We know, based on the data, that when Black people are in mental health crisis, people are more in favor of using police force, which leads to death. What the researchers showed, however, is that these type of community-based crisis responses are significantly more effective at servicing, treating, and protecting people in mental health crisis. This has been done in CAHOOTS, the Denver Star program. Right? Not only does it prevent, right, the employment of police, you also see the downward trend of crime because the police aren't there to create crime. Right? Crime is often an interaction between policing and a vulnerable community. Right? We had the Patterson Healing Collective, which I referenced earlier, who've done a lot of work to intervene on violence, such that people that they interacted with who had experienced violence, of their first 105 victims, they experienced very little. I think it was fewer than 5 were injured in retaliation. Right? So as opposed to applying these models of criminology and incarceration, we know, and this is the thing, at this point we have the research, we know this is significantly more beneficial, significantly more effective. I have a resource here called Umu's Radical Mental Health First Aid, because one of the primary things we also have to address, for a lot of people, when you see somebody who's unhoused, when you see a Black person or a Black man who's living outside who might be experiencing crisis, if we're being honest, a lot of people feel fear. A lot of people, I still have students I have to talk to about the term, like talking about those people like crackheads or whatever it might be. Right? We think about that with the decades of stigma and propaganda that's weaponized against these people, as opposed to people that we have the opportunity and ability to serve and help, right? As opposed to these people as a member of community. We're seeing as you get more and more gentrification in these communities, that violence just increases. And so what Umu's radical mental health first aid does is it helps people sit with their own internal distress when you experience somebody who might be in crisis, right? Wondering, is this person unsafe or am I feeling unsafe? Like, what is actually the issue here? And how can I apply my ideas of community and safety, right, in service to this person, as opposed to just introducing more violence because I feel uncertain, because a black man or black boy's body who's in distress is scary to me. Next slide, please. We know that African-centered restorative programs as well. So we have a book volume coming out. I was hoping to have that out by now, but we're still working on it one day. And one of the research articles shows that African-centered restorative programs are significantly more effective for curtailing even the variables that they claim to care about, those being recidivism, aggression. When we look at partnering with local African-centered organizations to work with black boys on what are the structural and communal conditions that are shaping your interaction with the state, we see significantly lower recidivism rates, right? We see increased communal behavior as people are invited to the community, and we see less observed aggression. And so we had this question because we see a lot of these states, and I know a lot of, I have a friend right now whose grandmother was actually carjacked in Maryland. And a lot of the people in the family were terrified. When you have an elder in your family who's been victimized in that way, all of a sudden, all those thoughts come into mind. Like, if I find those kids, if I find those boys, we're gonna do X, Y, Z, right? Does anybody know where they are? When I find them, we're gonna do X, Y, Z. And returning to Bobby Wright's idea that everybody has the right to deal with menticide, we're forcing people to think about how they can create safety in a very limited way. The only ways they know how to think about it are policing and violence, right? Or completely surrendering agency. Well, I think the important thing for us to understand is there are additional pathways that are not given the same level of highlight and investment and support that have demonstrated research efficacy for our black boys. So that's the important piece that we pull in as well. And next slide, I think that might be my last one. And one more piece, and this is a bit more rarefied, a bit more specific, but we know black psychologists specifically can help in forensic cases and shaping those outcomes. When I first started my training I was going to a maximum security prison, and this was a black woman, in fact, who had said back in the 90s, she'd been incarcerated for as long as I've been alive. She had a white psychiatrist go on the stand and say she was lying about all of her mental health problems. Right? Everything she had been through, whether it be domestic abuse, physical violence, they said this was a lie to gain favor with the court. Because of that, the court threw out all of her mental health files, and she was incarcerated for life. I met her at the time, it must have been 27, 28 years later, right? And we were able to, through the opinion of a psychological report informed by black psychology, secure her parole 27 years later, right? We do that with 2 black men as well. Black men who were incarcerated, in fact, for defending themselves from police officers. Right? Forensic psychological reports have a strong anchoring impact on how judges adjudicate cases for black men and for black boys. When you go to some of these forensic psychology conferences, you meet some of the most conservative, socially conservative psychologists that you will find. Right? They maintain these ideologies at this point out of bounds with what the literature and the research suggests, because again, this is in service to a particular political project. When we invite psychological reports that are rooted in our ideas of how a psychic life and consciousness, see, they're trying to shut this down, I'm telling y'all. I was on a tear too. When you introduce these ideas, these assessments of black boyhood, black manhood, how they experience life and stress, it significantly shapes the outcome in ways that produce life. I want to note, many of us were grieving the state execution, assassination of Marcellus the last few days, right? I went through, and this is how I cope, I went through his previous case files, and I was looking at the report that the psychologist did. And there's nothing against that psychologist, because I think he was doing the best with the tools he had at the time. But all you got was a series, pages and pages of documents on how traumatized and hurt this black man had been. With white people, when you introduce that, that's often seen as mitigating. The judge threw out all that evidence because his point was the jury could have easily seen this and thought this person was irredeemable. So it does not matter what he had been through. And so thus the entirety of his mental health background was thrown out of the case, right? We know that when you're rooting this in black forensic psychology, when you have these assessments that show that, no, we actually have the research that shows that we can improve people's lives, that when we attend to each of these factors, people can go on, in fact, often do go on to be highly productive members of their community. You get beneficial outcomes. In the last few years, I pull a lot of this from people are familiar with Asa Hilliard. People are less familiar with Thomas Hilliard. Thomas Hilliard was a black forensic psychologist in San Francisco, and he did that work with the San Quentin Six, right? When they were experiencing torture in the confines of San Quentin prison, he lent his report, and it got them to remove them from the forced institutionalization and torture of San Quentin prison. I say this all to say that these collaborations can matter. We're not talking about reforming a system, but we're talking about intervening on the continuation of state-based harm. I believe that's my last one. You hit the next one? Yeah, let's get into questions.
Man, before we get into questions, y'all can do a little better than that. Come on now. Y'all can do a little better than that. I appreciate this brother dropping that wisdom on him, because surely Dr. Tommy is a hard act to follow, but you did what you did. You did what you did, so we know we in the room with good company.